I must stress from the outset that it is a non-technical session. I am not an engineer, but this is more about the communications elements of when things go wrong. So thanks for joining us, and thank you to Alison for arranging today's session. If we could go on to the first slide, please, Alison, or on the next slide. Well, okay, I've already said I'm not an engineer, so what am I and what do I know? Well, I was director of CECA Northwest from 2012 to 2021, and I'm a former managing director of a PR and public affairs agency based in Manchester, with clients that included Sainsbury's, 3M, Salford University, several branches of the NHS, as well as local government and several national government departments. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Marketing, and I've got a fair bit of crisis management experience, most critically for British Waterways and the NHS. Next slide, please. So let's have a little look at what we're going to cover today. As I've said, I'm not an engineer, so it is non-technical. It's to explore what to do when things go wrong, and most importantly, when they become publicly known. And that involves working out how to respond to the media and how to protect your organization's reputation. Crisis management can also be called reputation management. The two things are both opposite sides of the same coin, effectively. I'll give you a few details of some do's and don'ts, a few tricks of the trade, a few tips that I've picked up over 30 odd years of handling public relations. And I'll go through a series of case studies based on actual crises that happened. And that's where I'd like to get you to vote on what to do about them, what you think would be the best approach. And we'll look at the various options about how to handle an incident when it goes wrong. Next slide, please. Things that we can't cover, really. I keep saying I'm not an engineer. Well, I'm not. So there won't be any technical issues about the specifics of a civil engineering project that may go wrong for whatever reason. We're not going to look at the global and political crises such as the pandemic or international conflicts, although later on we do touch on how they do affect the role of the civil engineering contractor. So there's a brief reference to that. And I'm not going to look at any specific client-related issues, but I'm more than happy to handle them on a one-to-one basis outside the scope of this webinar. So if you want to get in touch, by all means do so. Or if you've got any questions that you can put in a sort of generic way without naming names, I'll do my very best to answer them. In fact, if anybody does have a question, just stick a hand up and I'll try and answer them as we go along. There are quite a lot of slides to get through. So sometimes it's not always a good idea to wait to the very end if there's something that needs clarifying or there's something that you'd like to know. So do feel free to do that, and I'm sure Alison can direct you accordingly. Now, every crisis is different, but the thing is, they often tend to require the same sort of things in how you respond. And these are a few tips that I would recommend you consider if you do find yourselves having to deal with a crisis. First, try to consult with others wherever possible. There's nothing worse than trying to handle something that's gone wrong entirely on your own. You'll find that it can be a difficult and rather frightening prospect to do that. And you can get some comfort from working with colleagues, stakeholders, or even in some cases, the client. But remember, the media do work to very tight deadlines, and social media, things can appear instantaneously. You get very little time to work out the best way to respond. Second thing you need to know is who's ultimately in charge within your organization. Who is the person that you need to get approval from to say anything publicly? Whatever you do, don't shoot from the hip. Find out who you need to speak to, who you need to get authority from to go back to a journalist or a post on social media to respond. But then again, responding isn't always the answer. There's a bit of a judgment call here, and you need to consider whether responding will simply make things worse by prolonging coverage of the crisis. What do I mean by that? Well, if something fairly minor has happened and it's been picked up, say on Twitter or X, sometimes it's best just to let it go if it's minor. If it's catastrophic, that's when you need to take a judgment call. It may be that you do need to respond, but always think about, will it snowball? Will there be a response to your response, and so on? You end up with a sort of awful tennis match with coverage being extended far beyond the original piece that comes out either on social or traditional media. Next slide, please. Oh, listen. Some don'ts. Never lie. I'm sure that nobody today would do that. The trouble is sometimes, to use a phrase much beloved by politicians, you can be economical with the truth. Well, I wouldn't recommend that. It pays to be as open as you're able to be. And if that sounds like I'm hedging my bets, I'm not. You can tell the media, or you can put on social media, as much as you're able to at a given time. And we'll come on to that in a minute as to what that actually means in practice. Never, ever say no comment. They only do that on television or in the movies. It makes you look shifty. It really does. In over 30 years of doing PR, I have never once said no comment to a journalist, and I have never recommended to my clients that they would say that either. Not always with success, I'm afraid. Some people do insist on saying no comment. It's not good. Never denigrate any other organization or individual, no matter what they've said about your firm. Don't get into a slanging match. It won't help you, and you won't come out of it smelling of roses. It's a dangerous thing to do, so don't do it. And the fourth one is something that perhaps people don't always know. Just because you think you're in the right, you may actually be in the right. Don't expect to avoid negative coverage. The rights and wrongs of an issue matter far less to the media than getting a good story. As a newsreader once said not that long ago, it's bad news that sells more papers than good news. So they don't really care about who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. So whether you're in the right or not, don't expect to avoid negative coverage just because of that. You actually need to take some action to mitigate those particular circumstances. Next slide, please, Alison. So this is over to you now. What sort of crises do you think contractors, civil engineering contractors face? What are the sort of things that might cause a problem? What might go wrong? If you want to chuck a few ideas out, we'll address them in the next few slides that follow. Any ideas? Okay, well, look, that was a bit unfair. Sometimes you need a bit of a prompt with these things. There'll be questions later on for you to answer, and chances to vote on the best way to handle a particular crisis. But let's look at the sort of crises that could affect a civil engineering firm. So next one, please, Alison. Safety. This is number one. We all know civil engineering is still an industry where accidents occur, despite the many improvements that continue to be made. It is an industry where things can happen. Now, here's one. What about a site that either is or appears to be unsafe? What do I mean by that? Site might be perfectly safe, but supposing a member of the public who knows nothing about civil engineering looks through the fence and thinks it looks unsafe, and then contacts the press. The press is going to run a story saying that they think that particular site is unsafe. And immediately there's an issue affecting your reputation as a safe and professional contractor, and you have to address it, even if the site is perfectly safe. So it is an issue about perception. If the site is actually unsafe, well, that's a straightforward matter. You've got to put it right. But if it's perceived to be unsafe, even though it isn't, you still have to act. Third thing, and this is probably the most worrying, if a member of staff or the public is hurt as a result of civil engineering works, that needs very, very careful handling. And I'm going to give some specific examples as to how to do that. This is an area that has been of great concern, and thankfully it's something that we see less and less of these days as improvements to health and safety on site are made every single year. Next slide, please, Alison. Delivery. Just a few examples. I'm sure you can think of many more. You're the professionals after all. An environmental or pollution related issue. That will always get picked up, both in the trade press, construction news, construction inquirer, new civil engineer, as well as the locals. That has a real chance of affecting your organization's reputation. Project issues. Now, you'd think that these would normally be things that existed between you and the client, that they wouldn't actually go public, like a scheme overrunning or going over budget. Well, I can tell you that I have met journalists in the past who have done a lot of spade work, a lot of digging into a particular project and found out if it has gone over budget or if it's overrun, and have questioned why. And these aren't necessarily the trade media. These could be local press too. So it's something to be prepared for. Make sure you've got an answer. Perfectly good reasons for a scheme going over, overrunning in terms of time or going over budget. There may be perfectly good reasons that you could explain, but you need to know. You need to have them at your fingertips. Third one is, it's not particularly difficult, but again, it needs skillful handling. Prolonged disruption to a community. A bridge that's out of order that separates two halves of a town or makes taxi drivers' lives an absolute misery, for example. You've got to be able to say why. Why is the disruption? Why is it being prolonged? What's the problem? What's the cause? Not necessarily to wriggle out of the issue, but to provide a cogent, sensible answer. Next slide, please, Alison. Corporate. These don't always get into the press, but when they do, again, they can cause mayhem. A strike or a labour issue. That can cause huge problems, and I can come back to that in a few slides' time, because I've got a precise example of where a labour issue escalated and became front page news in a local paper. Loss of accreditation. I wouldn't have thought that would normally make the press. Construction Inquirer, though, which you may have seen, it's the online daily news feed, they have picked that up from time to time. So one just to be careful about. On the one hand, it's great to say that you've got ROSPA Gold or all sorts of other awards. That's terrific, and they get covered. But at the same time, they will cover any lack of accreditation or loss of it for whatever reason. Third one, this has actually hit the headlines a lot over the last couple of years. Breaches of competition and market authority law, cartels, price fixing. That has affected this sector, and it is something to watch out for very carefully. It's not something you can mitigate. It's not something you can do anything about. I think it's one where you have to hold your hands up and say, we got it wrong. There's no way of getting around that one by finding a PR answer for it. Financial, it's probably too broad to cover today. There might be a few bits where I'll touch on it, but really this is more the preserve of our legal and commercial seminars that Geraldine Fleming runs so ably for us. Things like liquidated damages. That's not my area of expertise, but it's something that she can certainly advise on, and I know would be very happy to talk to you individually as well. Next slide, please, Alison. Now, when something goes wrong, how open should you be? I'm not saying that you should cover things up or avoid the truth, but how much do you reveal? Now, first one, there can be a lot of benefits from volunteering minor project issues to the media. A brief overrun, a slight problem on site that isn't catastrophic, a minor issue. If you go public with those to the media, social media or traditional media, you'll be seen as open and honest. You'll get respect and trust for that. And the chances are you might be treated better if something really serious happens. It's not always easy to persuade the powers that be to go public about when something's gone wrong. But if it's minor, it won't do your reputation any harm, and it is some sort of insurance when something goes horribly wrong. Now let's look at, say, where there is prolonged disruption to a community. How much do you reveal? At this point, there's no point covering anything up. It's best to give a completely straightforward explanation as to why there is a delay and what you're going to do about it. So in some cases, be open, but if it's catastrophic, that's another matter. So next slide, please, Alison. Now, if the media are in touch with you, they want answers to a problem, a crisis that's happened. They want to know why it's happened, what's been involved, what you're going to do about it. And they say, we need you to reply by 2 o'clock. Well, always respond when you say you're going to do it, even if you've got nothing new to tell them. That keeps them warm. If they think you're ignoring them, they get suspicious, they start digging, and they find things out that you really don't want them to know. But as I said before, always get approval first and never volunteer details of a catastrophic incident. There are 2 major incidents that we'll be looking at in a little while. And don't forget, not all battles are worth fighting, especially those that prolong any negative coverage. That's this judgment call. How serious is it? How much is it likely to affect your reputation? And is it best just to let it go? Next slide, please, Alison. Something you do need to understand when dealing with the media is how to work with deadlines. They are very much a one-way street. If you've got a great story and you want to get something into the media, you have to work to their deadlines. However, if the media wants to cover an incident, you have to work to their deadlines too. So be prepared. If they want an answer by 2 o'clock, you give them an answer by 2 o'clock, or that you risk negative or uninformed, incomplete coverage that then you have to respond to, which is really what you don't want. You want to get things clear and straightforward at the earliest possible opportunity to protect your reputation. But even though the media will always set the timescales for deadlines, it's worth understanding how they work. So I'm going to take you through what deadlines are involved. You probably know some of this, but it's worth just setting it out clearly so you've got this in front of you. Traditional print media deadlines are determined when a publication appears. So a daily newspaper goes to print late at night to be on sale very early in the morning, usually hit the newsstands sometime after 5. An evening paper goes to print early in the morning, and they usually go on sale just after lunch. It differs from place to place. The trade press are weeklies, typically, and their deadlines are either Tuesday or Thursday. It depends on the day they come out. Construction News, I think the deadline for that is Tuesday, if you want to get it in the following week's issue. Broadcast coverage, that's TV and radio, it's quicker than print, but it's determined by how quickly they can get a crew out to the incident. If it's television, they need pictures. So if they need pictures, they need to get a camera crew out to see what's happened. Radio's different. They can do a lot over the phone, and a phone interview with you can happen almost immediately. That's when you have to be prepared. But even more immediate than a radio interview over the phone is social media. That's transformed the entire landscape of crisis management and how you handle communications. It requires you to act far faster than in the past. It's much more difficult to give yourself time to respond to an incident if it's on X or Instagram, and it gives you less time to consult with colleagues, to have that protection of knowing that there's other people supporting what you're saying, that you've got approval from higher up. You are put under huge amounts of pressure. And this increases the risk of getting things wrong. Working without authority and not having time to consider what would be the best way to respond. Now, what do you do about it? It isn't easy. Social media expects fast responses. You don't have to give them. Print media, broadcast media, that's one-to-one with a journalist. And that has to happen. Now, so there is a difference. Although you think you've got to reply straight away to a post that appears on X or Instagram, you're not dealing with a journalist. Not necessarily anyway. If, though, somebody from New Civil Engineer or the local paper or the local radio station contacts you, you're dealing with a journalist. So you have to respond straight away. So although social media requires instant responses, sometimes hold back and don't feel that you have to be pushed into it just because that's the way that social media works these days. Next slide, please, Alison. Now, some things that I would recommend you all do. Look inside your organization. What have you got? These are the tools that you really need to have to be sure that you're well prepared for handling the communications elements of a crisis. Have you got a risk register? And who manages it? And is it updated? Now, I ask about it being updated because that's important. If over the last 12 months, say, you have been involved in a crisis, it would be good to know how you responded to it and what the outcome was. And that may shape the development of the risk register. It may be something that you feel should be included. So it needs to be kept fresh with details of the responses that you've been able to make and the reaction to it and the outcome. Has your company got clear lines of communication responsibility? So if you have to respond to the media, how do you get hold of the person who is ultimately responsible for giving you authority to reply? What happens if they're on holiday? What happens if they're not in the office? That needs to be set out clearly so you aren't left holding the baby, as it were. And that means, are you in a position to react quickly to meet media deadlines? If you can't, you've got a problem. Now, do you know who all your key stakeholders are for any given crisis? I don't like the word stakeholders, but it does mean lots of people. It can mean the client, it could mean the HSE, it could be all kinds of regulators. Who does it involve? Is it local community groups, perhaps? It's worth setting out for every project details of who your stakeholders are and at what point you would need to involve them in how you respond to a crisis. Training. I'll come back to training. Now, beyond this little webinar, what training might you and your colleagues need in dealing with a crisis? It's something I'm happy to help with. So outside the scope of this webinar, talk to me if you want to know more about that. But what sort of training do you think would help you? And again, I'll give you some examples from the real life examples that come in a bit about where training's been vital. And then how do you carry out a review following a crisis to ensure that lessons are learned? Again, this may feed into the risk register. It's important intelligence to set out what's been learned over a period of time. That what you've done September 2024 may be quite different from what you might have done in September 2023. So look inside your organization, check that you've got all of these things clearly set out and available to you. Next slide, please, Alison. Okay, I kept talking about actual crises. Enough of the theory. Let's look at some of the reality. Some of it's pretty horrible. I've got a few examples here that based on actual crises. They are ones that really happened. And I have chosen ones that I've worked on that are quite a few years old. And that's primarily to protect anybody who might have been affected by them. There are more recent ones, but I'm more wary of sharing those with you at this stage. Let's wait another 10 years. If I'm still doing webinars in 10 years' time, which I doubt. Right, a staff issue rarely goes public. And it's generally best handled by internal disciplinary processes. But there are exceptions. Next slide, please, Alison. I bet you won't see a headline like this in most webinars. Well, there's a reason for it. Two things happened, totally separate incidents. And the question is, which of the two should require a response? The first one is a senior manager who's discovered watching porn videos at work, and this becomes known throughout the organization's staff. The second incident, totally unrelated, is a receptionist who's asked by a journalist to comment on a hunt accidentally going across the land owned by her company. Now, If you think that a response is necessary for the porn videos, vote A. If you think it's necessary for the receptionist commenting on a hunt going across land owned by a company, vote B. I'll be fascinated to see what you say. Okay, well, shall we plow on a bit then? Okay, I'll give you the answer. It was B. Although the senior manager watching porn videos was known throughout the organization, it never became public knowledge. So the only advice I was able to offer the client was to check the facts carefully so that the individual wouldn't go to the press and complain about being unfairly disciplined. It was an HR issue. It was one for the HR team to get right, to make sure that they didn't make a martyr out of the guy, and that he wasn't going to do anything silly as a result of it. It never became public, so there's no actual response needed. So next slide, please, Alison. Now, the one about hunting. What happened was the receptionist said she detested hunting, and the local press reported that and made it sound like her employers felt the same way. So that did require a response, and it was necessary to make a statement to the press saying that what they reported was just the opinion of one individual and that the company took no position on the rights and wrongs of hunting. And the receptionist was told that she should not offer personal opinions to the press while at work. Well, sounds kind of obvious. What it provoked, though, was a program of an induction program for all front of house staff who were recruited to be told about what to do if a journalist rang the office. And that was something that I ran for about 3 years for every new cohort of staff that would be working in the front of the organization, the public facing part of it. And we go through it and make it very clear that this was the sort of thing that could affect the reputation of the employer if they were speaking without authority or the facts. So it involved training. That was the response to it. Sounds very minor, but it provoked a reaction, and it did improve how front of house staff responded to queries when they were called by the media. Okay, next one, Alison, please. A labour dispute. Now, a national builders merchant wanted to sell off a very large site in the Midlands and move to a much smaller one. And this was due to increased competition from a much bigger chain. Now, what that meant was that by downsizing, they would lose 40 jobs. It was an enormous site before, and they were uncompetitive. So they were having to trim the size of the organization accordingly. Oh, you read my mind, Alison, thank you. So what do? The director of the Midlands region, he was horrified about this decision to move and downsize, and really angry about the redundancies. So he arranged a demonstration at the gates of the site and invited the press along to come and talk and take photographs. And guess what? Yes, it appeared on the front page of the next day's evening paper. His chairman insisted on sacking the director. So what would you do? Any ideas? I'd be interested to know. Well, I'll tell you in that case. Next slide, please. This is all about damage limitation. I was a consultant to this particular company, and it took me 2 hours to persuade the chairman not to sack his director, and instead put him on gardening leave, paid leave instead. Again, this was to avoid the director of the Midlands region appearing to be a martyr. It was to avoid the risk too that the story would continue to be covered negatively if the director were to tell the press that he'd been sacked. It would just prolong the agony. So once I had approval, grudgingly given to me by the chairman of the company, I spoke to the editor of the local paper and said that the alternative to move into a smaller site would be to close its operation in the town altogether. And although 40 jobs would be lost by downsizing, if they didn't move, 60 jobs would be lost altogether. So the move would actually protect 60 jobs within the town. It wasn't a perfect solution, but we didn't get negative coverage after that. And in fact, the press covered the opening of the new site very positively. But if we hadn't had that conversation with the local paper about what was involved in the move and why it was actually protecting jobs that would otherwise have been lost, it would have been prolonged. And we also avoided, of course, the issue of making the director of the Midlands region appear to be victimised or a martyr. We managed to set the record straight. Next slide, please, Alison. Okay, this is the worst major incident I have ever handled. It was the most distressing, and it was one where the media behaved appallingly. Not all of them, but some of them. And it was one where I really had one arm behind my back. I wasn't able to speak out frankly or do much more than that, but it still needed handling very carefully. Okay, this is what happened. A canal boat was hired to take a party of people with severe mobility issues on a trip along the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. But the boat was too long for the lock. Now, this canal has wider but shorter locks than most canals. They're a different shape, going back to the 18th century. And as a consequence, the boat became stuck in one of the locks. The bow, the front of the boat, sank down and was wedged and could not be freed. And the boat consequently filled with water. And 4 people in wheelchairs could not be helped out in time and subsequently drowned. This became public knowledge very, very quickly. And the media wanted details of those who died. They wanted their names and addresses of the families. And they also wanted to know whose fault it was. That's the situation. Now, the questions that I need to ask myself in handling this, and I was handling it for British Waterways at the time, I need to ask myself these questions and find out as far as I could what the answers were before saying or doing anything. First of all, while the boat was in good condition, should it have been hired out on this canal when we know that the boat was too long to fit normally in the locks? It had to go sort of at an angle rather than straight ahead. Had the people in the wheelchairs, carers, been fully trained, and were they competent to deal with such an emergency? What about the regulator, the boat safety scheme? Were they at fault in any way? And was British Waterways, which is now the Canal and River Trust, were they responsible in any way? And if so, how? Those are the questions I need to ask myself. I didn't have much time. For the next 4 hours, the phone rang off the hook. It was journalist after journalist firing questions and wanting answers. Next slide, please, Alison. So I was handling this for British Waterways, as I've mentioned. There are 2 questions for you, and we'll take them in turn. First of all, what should I have told the media in response to their demand for the victims' addresses, names, and where their families are from? What should I have told them? The second question, what should I have told the media regarding whose fault it was for the tragedy? Well, let's deal with the first one first. What should I have told the media in response for their request to know the names and addresses of the victims? Any suggestions, please? Well, I hope to goodness you never have to handle anything quite like this. Next slide, please, Alison. We'll go into this. So what should I have told them? Tell them nothing is the answer. Now, this isn't about being economical with the truth. This is about the correct procedure to follow when a fatality has occurred. They're almost always led by the emergency services. And the only response to tell the media is that we are following their lead. It's usually the police in this case. Or if it hasn't been a fatality, it could have been a serious accident. It could be a case of following the wishes of the family. Say if it was one of your employees who had been hurt on site. But before doing anything, it's important first to check with the emergency services if it's a fatality. If it's a member of staff, speak to the family if you can. You may also want to talk to the HSE, and certainly you would want to talk to your client. But you can never say anything publicly that may affect a full assessment of what caused the incident and any legal proceedings that may result from it. So as I said at the beginning of this section, your hands are tied. I was trying to do this with one arm behind my back. And so when something like this happens, a fatality on a site, there's very little that you can say. You have to follow the lead of the emergency services. If it's less serious, if it's an accident, but that's non-fatal, you must speak to the family and probably your client before you say anything else. For instance, if I have worked in the nuclear industry, if you're working on Sellafield site, they have a very strict health and safety policy, and you would have to work directly with the client in any response. They would probably, Sellafield would probably want to take the lead on that. Next slide, please, Alison. So what should I have told the media regarding whose fault it was for the tragedy? Tricky one, this. My job is to protect the client's reputation. At the same time, the rule is never denigrate a third party or anybody else, but do try and buy some time. The trouble is, in this particular incident, it was so serious and such a tragedy that there really wasn't time. I was having to field call after call after call, as I say, for several hours. All I was able to say was a full report would be made public once the incident had been fully investigated. So as much as anything, my job in this particular incident was that of a firewall between the victims' families, my client, British Waterways, and the media, who were hounding everybody to try and get answers. We got through that pretty well. It took, although there was so little I could say on the day, I had to say it to a lot of people, and it took several weeks for this finally to quieten down in terms of the news. Then, of course, there was a public inquiry. Then, of course, there were reports that came out. So it was a story that ran for an awful long time, even after I couldn't say very much at all about it. Next slide, please, Alison. This one's not quite as awful. Thank goodness. The Muggle Brook culvert runs beneath the Leeds and Liverpool Canal just north of Liverpool. With a rise in water levels passing through the culvert, the roof of the culvert expanded, breaching into the canal bed. If you can imagine, it's an arch that pinged out and ruptured the canal bed. That caused an inundation of canal water into the culvert, leading to the progressive failure of the culvert and resulting in the canal bursting its banks. So the gap that was broken into the canal bed sent canal water down into the culvert and resulted in over 200 properties being flooded, primarily residential. Now, the question is, whose fault was it? This is a really, really tricky one. British Waterways was responsible for the canal, the maintenance of it, the management of it, to ensure that it was in good condition. North West Water, United Utilities today, in those days, they were responsible for the culvert. And the local authority had granted planning permission for a housing development beside the upstream section of the brook. So whose fault was it? Was it British Waterways, North West Water, or the local authority? What do you think? Well, let's carry on. Let's see whose fault it was. Well, I think, to be completely fair, there have probably been failings by more than one party. But the root cause goes back to an increase in surface water runoff from permission being granted to build more houses than the culvert could cope with. So that puts the root cause, if you like, squarely with the local authority for granting planning permission. Yes, perhaps the canal could have been better maintained. We will never know. Perhaps the culvert should have been more regularly inspected and monitored when increased levels of water were going through it. Yes, perhaps that could have happened too. But if the houses hadn't been built, the additional flow of water through the culvert would not have happened. This is a while ago. I wonder if today people might have been thinking about net zero. When this happened, net zero wasn't a phrase that even people thought of. So who knows? If that happened today, there may be other reasons or other explanations as to what happened. So what it revealed was the need to respond quickly. British Waterways was first on the scene. We hired a hall to meet local residents. And I thought from the outset, it was very important to let the local community vent their anger. Shout and bawl, get cross. But keep this hall available for the long term so that we could keep the residents up to date with developments. We were there within 24 hours. Within 3 or 4 days, we had exhibition boards showing what had happened, what the plan was to repair the canal and the culvert, and what the next steps were, what the timescales were, and so on. And the public were invited to attend this whenever they wanted. So even though there's a bit of doubt as to precisely whose fault it was, because British Waterways acted quicker than anybody else and were seen to listen and care about the feelings of local people, the media ended up being less critical of British Waterways than they were with North West Water and the local authority. It was great, a great result that we managed to get away with it, even though it was filthy water from British Waterways canal that flooded the houses. So be quick, listen, allow people to vent their anger. It's a release valve. It helps. Next slide, please, Alison. Okay, let's get back to the contractor. I mean, I've talked in generalities about crises and the sort of things that happen, the sort of things you need to know. But what about the role of the civil engineering contractor? Well, in most cases, the contractor will be working on an asset owned by the client. That means that the response to an incident will normally be led by the client. So it's important to liaise closely with them to understand what the client plans to do and whether or not you have a role in it, whether you feel that the client's response is acceptable to you or not. What do I mean by that? Well, there may be occasions when the contractor feels that the client has passed more responsibility to them than is reasonable, or has sought to blame the contractor for failings on the client side. I'm sure you've all had experience of that at one time or another. And that makes it all the more important to maintain a thorough and up-to-date risk register with case studies, details of who did what and how you mitigated a particular problem, and what you might learn from it next time. Next slide, please, Alison. I did say at the outset that we weren't really going to talk about international conflicts or the pandemic. There's one aspect of the pandemic which struck me, and I thought it might just be worth touching on as a sort of suggestion as to what you might want to consider for the future. In 2020, the government ordered that, unlike other sectors, construction work should continue as far as possible during the pandemic. That caused a problem. A lot of people didn't like the idea that construction sites were open. They felt that they shouldn't have been doing that, and that a lot of construction workers faced criticism and even attacks from the public. Now, the point I'm making here is that there was a failure to distinguish between house building, for example, and the vital role, the essential services maintained by civils contractors. And that resulted in even civils contractors being attacked by the public. For working on a highways job, for instance, it was the perfect time to work on the highways. There was very little traffic. Roads were quiet. It was a very good time to be doing it. And the weather, 2020, was spectacular as well. But people sought to criticize without fully understanding the difference between what a civils contractor does and what a house builder does. One, of course, is absolutely essential to our quality of life. The other is important, but perhaps less directly essential to our quality of life. But how would you respond in circumstances like this? Well, trade bodies and professional institutions like CECA, the ICE, they're probably best placed to promote the difference between the essential work of civil engineering and other branches of the construction industry. However, I think contractors would benefit from getting that message across themselves in their own communications with local communities, use of social media, websites, site hoardings, and so on. It's a good message to get across that if you don't have civil engineering works effectively, this country goes back to the Stone Age. I'll stop banging on about that. That is one of my soapbox themes, but it's not for today. Next slide, please, Alison. Now, apologies are really important. Getting them right makes all the difference. Getting them wrong can cause huge problems. Now, lawyers tend to say that when things go wrong, you should act like the monarchy. Never explain, never apologize. Well, that's okay if you're the royal family. It doesn't work for everybody. If a crisis is likely to require legal input, and quite often they do, the timing of an apology should be guided by lawyers. You don't want to go public with an apology if it involves appearing to take some sort of liability, accept some sort of liability for what happened. You need to be very careful about the timing of that. If it's not going to require legal input, in any event, seek advice and get approval from senior management about how to frame the apology, what to include in it, and what to avoid saying. And any apology should always be made with having the full facts at your fingertips. So you know both the full extent of what the apology should comprise and also have an idea what comeback it may provoke. Sometimes an apology can actually end up causing a bigger problem than the incident itself if there's a toing and froing of comment on it. So make sure your apology is effective. See, I mean, whatever the lawyers say, a policy of never apologizing, it overlooks the risk of longer-term reputational damage. And that can be prevented by an appropriate and well-crafted apology. But a badly handled apology can make things so much worse. It can prolong negative coverage of the initial crisis, cause further negative coverage due to it being a poor apology, not good enough, and lead to a long-term negative profile of the company as not caring. And these days, more than ever, more than when I was running my PR company, being seen to care, being seen to do the right thing is far more important than it's ever been. Next slide, please, Alison. Damaging apologies. Now, this is just the stuff to avoid. Apologies that do more harm than good are those that miss the point. Ones that are self-serving, self-defense dressed up as an apology. They appear insincere. They add insult to injury. If it really looks like you can't believe that they're apologizing. And some are worse than the original offense. They can be so bad that the apology needs to be apologized for too. And if you get into that kind of loop, you've got a problem. Now, I'm not going to click these links. If you want to click the links, that's up to you. Do it outside this webinar. They're incredibly offensive, which is why I'm not going to do this now. But if you're going to apologize, don't make things worse. And I cannot believe that the founder of Papa John's pizza chain and a former US senator and comedian, incidentally, could get things so utterly wrong. But they have. I would have thought Papa John's might have had an in-house communications specialist, and I'd have thought an articulate American senator would know better, but what do I know? They are shockers. A better way of apologizing, yes, if you're going to do it, it can be helpful to talk about lessons learned. What are you going to avoid? What will you avoid next time round? It's good to seek advice or input from peers, experts, stakeholders, anybody else who can make sure that next time round you get the apology right. And training. I can't stress enough. Keep that fresh. Keep training. Keep your understanding of how to apologize, how to handle a crisis fresh by making sure that training is in place to cope with every new development. It might be climate change. It might be mental health. It might be well-being. It might be all sorts of issues that you need to take into account as part of your training program. And an apology is rarely enough on its own. It's great if you can go back and say what changes and improvements you've made and what you've learned from it. Next one, please, Alison. Now, we're near the end. Just a little funny one, just to amuse, although in questionable taste, I'm afraid. Some clients are pretty good at managing PR in a crisis. And this is a story that I know was true, because at the time I was working for Greater Manchester Council, Bolton, of course, being part of Greater Manchester. But for several years, people thought this was an urban myth. Well, it wasn't. It really happened. And here's the background. A house builder wanted to construct hundreds of luxury homes in Bolton. Despite objections from local residents and the council, they began building after the government overturned the planning refusal by Bolton Council. These things happen. So, next slide, please, Alison. This was the headline that resulted. How on earth did that happen? Next slide, please, Alison. Well, to stop the development, even though it had been called in by the Secretary of State and they had overruled what Bolton Council had said, that they wanted to refuse planning consent, government said it should go ahead. But to stop the development, the council used its powers to name the streets, giving them the most offensive ones they could think of. Hitler Avenue, Belson Crescent, Goering Drive, as a means of both trying to deter the house builder from actually constructing the houses, and if they were actually going to do it, to deter people from buying them. Well, it was a clever idea. As I say, if not in perhaps the best possible taste. Yes, it would have been great if the council had won. On this occasion, they gave in and the development went ahead with normal street names. The only reason I include this is sometimes it pays to be creative. If you're going to be creative like this, for heaven's sake, make sure you get authority to be creative. This one came from the very top. It was a senior councillor. It wasn't a junior member of staff. So yes, this had the backing of the council behind it. But if you're going to be creative, make sure you've got people to back you. Otherwise, you could end up being hanged out to dry. Next slide, please, Alison. Okay, near the end now. To sum up part one, if you can, try and get yourself some extra time. Consult others where possible, senior management, the client, affected communities, and other stakeholders, if you can. Yes, time constraints can be a problem, but remember that the media work to tight deadlines. But with traditional print media and broadcast media, you're dealing with journalists, professionals. So make sure that you go back to them when you say you're going to. Social media, not always journalists, can be anybody. Now, while what appears in social media can be instantaneous and it looks like you need to give an instant reply, they're not journalists. They're not coming to you with a request for information. For the most part, they're not anyway. So you can buy a little more time than you think. So don't necessarily feel that you have to be pressured into responding immediately to a Twitter post or something you see on Instagram. And as I've said about too many times anyway, make sure you get approval for any response you give to the media. Don't try and do it all on your own. You need to have people backing what you say. Next one. Yes, always respond to the media when you say you're going to, even if you can't tell them anything more. It's courtesy. It doesn't sound like very much. It sounds like a waste of everybody's time. They expect that sort of courtesy. Consider whether responding will make things worse by simply prolonging coverage of the crisis. That's this judgment call I've talked about a few times. If it's minor, maybe let it go. If it's serious, how do you respond? And do it in a way that's not just going to prolong coverage week after week. You need to think about that. This is an area which I can advise you about in much more detail than we've got time for today. This is one that I've had patchy success. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes people are just reluctant to do it. But sharing bad practice, worst practice, can often be more useful than sharing best practice. Best practice is great. Pat each other on the back, say how well you've done. That's fine. Bad practice, where things have gone wrong, showing where you've made a mistake, showing where you've got things wrong, is a good thing. It's a chance to learn. It's a chance to learn from peers, from other people. But it only works if everyone else is willing to share too, and learn lessons for next time there's a crisis. Otherwise, you're on your own. Next slide, please. Well, that's me. Thanks very much indeed to you.